Hey folks, you are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council where we go across the state to talk about the environment. We talk about issues of the environment, stories around it, solutions to it. I'm here today in Plymouth, Michigan with Carly and David Cirilli, co-founders of Plymouth Pollinators, for the start of our pollinator mini-series here on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yes, of course. For new folks who are just tuning into this podcast, know that although this is the first episode of our pollinator mini-series, you'll be able to listen to any podcast episode within that mini-series in any order. We just came off of our transit mini-series where we went across the state to talk about how transit functions across different sorts of communities, from the rural to the heavily urban. And now I'm excited to do the same in a different sort of way with pollinators. So in episodes future, we'll go to a farm, we'll go to the wilderness or someplace close to it. But today we're here to talk about neighborhoods. We're here to talk about parks and gardens. Maybe the easiest way people can kind of come in contact with pollinators. Lastly, last housekeeping item, just want to mention that NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, is our supporter for this podcast. So thank you to them for making this possible. Enough about me blabbering away though and all that. Let's turn it to you two. So as a nonprofit worker, I know how tough nonprofit work can be. I'd have to imagine it's even tougher to start a nonprofit and then to keep it running for years and make it a successful thing. Could you talk a bit about your history and how it led up to the creation of Plymouth Pollinators?
Sure. I guess I'll start. So it kind of started like around 2014, just in our own backyard. So I was starting to notice less butterflies in my yard. So I've always been a gardener. And so I started doing some research and was reading about pollinator decline and shared that with Dave. And he's a pretty handy guy. And we started working on basically adding raised beds to our yard and creating more of a pollination space or habitat there. And so, it really started, in our own backyard. And then later he had some folks come over from work.
I worked at the City of Plymouth DPW, had some of the guys over for a barbecue. They'll come over for food, So, but they were really interested in what I was doing in the backyard. They really admired the raised beds we put in, all the pollinator gardens, and there were some spots around that needed some love. And so
in the city,
and my foreman at the time came to me and was like, "Hey, what do you think we did a pollinator garden in this little spot?" So that was our very first one, and all my coworkers and stuff were just really excited about doing this. And then after that little one, it was like people were looking for other spots for us to do. And our very next garden was at Lions Club, and that was right about the time COVID started.
We're a pandemic story.
Yeah, so we are a pandemic. So that one was, that was the start of pretty much Plymouth Pollinators unofficially was that garden. So
yeah, so it was kind of a collaboration. So it's great because we had, city buy-in, obviously, right from the get-go, and we had a pretty close relationship with the city. So we were working on these gardens, with the DPW. And so when people finally started coming out of their houses again after the pandemic, they saw the gardens, and it was just something that was really uplifting for them. And so, we would be out there working in the garden, and people would have questions for us. Some a little bit scary, like, how do I get butterfly eggs? We thought, well, okay, we need to get some education out there and start like a Facebook group or something so people can ask questions and get some good information. And at that point, we weren't a nonprofit at that time. It was just us. And then after about a year of that, we were getting so much interest, and people wanted to give us money and make donations and things like that, and wanted to see more of it. And that's when we realized like we really need to make this official and become a nonprofit. So we became a nonprofit in February of 2022. So we're not very old, but we've gotten a lot of, just a lot of support and interest. And I think the folks in the community are just really excited about it. We're known as the pollinators. Exactly. Right.
That's great. I love that. It's like a true community story where people just, interacting with you in a very nonchalant way.
Yeah.
I've come across the work you're doing and realized the environmental value of it and the aesthetic value, I'm sure, too.
Yeah, exactly. We know now, like when we're going to work in the gardens, obviously we have a lot more of them, but we know to like plan an extra hour for people just to come by and chit chat and ask questions or, things like that. So the fact that we're so accessible, I think is, it helps.
That's great. Yeah. I've heard actually on a past podcast episode, someone make the claim that, that like regardless of where you live, who you are, how you grew up, one of the first ways you do like an active environmental service is by like returning your bottles and cans into like the feeder as like a little kid. You go with your parents there. I have to imagine like gardening or even just being around gardens is another way where you have that first sort of exposure.
Yeah.
Very neat. Could you talk a little bit more about your gardens that you've created in these years since or that you've helped other people create here in the community?
Sure. So we've got a mix of large gardens, medium size, and then others, like we like to call them kind of micro habitats. So we started on a shoestring budget, obviously, in the beginning. And at that time, we were just really starting to learn more about native plants and where to find them and what to use. If we look back at pictures from when we first started, they don't look anything like they do now because we've obviously cycled in new plants and things. Involved. Typically, we don't just stick with just 3 or 4 species in one garden. We kind of put a lot in there, mainly because we're experimenting and also we're trying to normalize native plants to other people so they can see what they look like kind of out in the wild.
And plus working a lot in certain cities or townships, we're learning about ordinances. So a lot of places, by following certain ordinances, our gardens they're not an eyesore. They're not too tall. They're, they check a box, which is really nice. And so, that's been good to help residents or business owners know what they can or can't do in their own space. But
in a few of our gardens, we have some information boxes. So we put different educational flyers that we've created in there, like throughout the year, like early in the year, we'll put things in there about steps for spring cleanup, which is really don't do any cleanup. And then we have, for this time of year, it's like how to create a pollinator garden. Then we have, fall cleanup, planting tips. We just created a new one for dark skies. I was listening to one of your previous podcasts where we were talking about that a little bit, and how that affects pollinators as well. And we've got, like I said, they're all different sizes. In fact, our backs are a little bit sore today because over the weekend we were doing one of our larger gardens, and now we're starting to get grants from other organizations to put gardens in. So we've probably got 14, 15 gardens now. And now we're starting to branch off into the schools. So we did one at Tonda Elementary School in Canton. We just partnered with Isbister Elementary School here. And we have a couple on deck too. So the schools are getting interested as well.
Which is really good. You get the children hooked first.
Right. Because kids who love pollinators become adults who love pollinators.
Yes. It's suddenly the volunteer bases.
Exactly. No,
that is great. And for folks that are interested that aren't in the Plymouth area, your website has like a great little rundown. It really does run the gamut where you have your larger, maybe more traditional looking gardens, but you also have some that are like micro gardens, small, just kind of in a very much in a neighborhood meant to help give a little boost to the plant site. So,
2 of our micro gardens are in Old Village. One's at a coffee shop, Meridian, and then My Little Needle, and they're just right in front of the shop. And we get more comments from people about those gardens than even our bigger ones. It's just very cool. And so our thing is no space is too small. So.
I'd love to touch on that a little bit later. Okay. First, though, I feel like we should maybe talk a little bit about what pollinators are. I think a lot of us probably have a good sense of what they are in general, like in certain species or types of insects that they may be. But what, in your own words, is a pollinator, and what role does it serve in this particular environment that we're talking in the Plymouth area or at large?
I'll let you.
Okay. So pollinators are animals and insects like bees, hummingbirds, wasps, flies, butterflies, some bats, not necessarily here in Michigan, but they help plants grow and reproduce by moving pollen from flower to flower. So this allows the plants to produce fruits, seeds, new plants. And for the community, obviously, we need pollinators if, we want to eat. So 1 in 3 bites of food is made possible by pollinators. So I don't think people realize that. In fact, When we do our presentations, we have a slide that shows a picture of a grocery store, one that's like stocked full of, fresh produce and foods and fruits and vegetables. And then the other picture side by side is just kind of brown, right? Not a lot of color, no produce. So we really rely on pollinators, in our agricultural industry and, just for us, for fresh fruits and vegetables.
Yeah. And I'm sure especially important given, I think Michigan has the second most diverse crop variations in the country, just outside of California. So maybe a little more important than.
Yeah. So it's important because pollinators are in decline right now. We have, all kinds of stats here. Actually, I'll let you talk a little bit just about some of the bees, and because I don't think a lot of people understand just how many different variations of bees there are.
We focus a lot on the native bees. Honeybees, they were actually brought over by during the colonial times in like the 1600s for agriculture reasons. They were brought over from Europe. So, but the native bees that, like your bumblebees, your sweat bees, carpenter bees, mason bees, that's the ones we kind of focus on because a lot of those bees, you don't even notice you see them, but they're there. And it shows that you have a healthy ecosystem. There's over 450 native bees roughly in Michigan. I know, it's amazing.
I didn't know either of these things.
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
Yeah. And bees are, they're either social or they're considered solitary. Social bees are like your bumblebees. They have a hive, a queen, honeybees, of course, and some of the sweat bees. And the rest are considered solitary, meaning that they live on their own. They don't have a hive. Most of the bees are generalists, meaning they will go to pretty much any flower or any plant. And then roughly 25% are specialists, meaning they'll only go to a certain type of plant, but they are the best ones at pollinating that plant. So, and they will emerge around the same time when that flower is actually blooming, like a squash bee, for example. It will come around when the squash is blooming to pollinate it, and then you get your squash yield. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah, these little insects are just amazing.
Yeah, and about 98% of the bees are more solitary bees. And so a lot of those bees, they don't hibernate, they don't have hives. A lot of them have nests, under the ground, or they're, in sticks or twigs or whatever. And so that's why, when you hear a lot of these groups like ours that are saying, leave your leaves, leave your stems, don't clean up, it's because these bees, especially, in the springtime, they're still hibernating. They haven't woken up yet because there's nothing out there for them yet. And so when you start cleaning all the debris up, you're literally throwing away, some butterflies and bees, because butterflies are the same. So, obviously the monarch butterfly migrates every year, but a lot of your other butterflies here that are native to Michigan, they actually overwinter in that leaf debris or on sticks and twigs and things like that. So it's really important to kind of hold off for your cleanup, and don't clean up in the fall. So we just tell people, go watch football or go to the cider mill, whatever, be a little less work for you to do. And then and same thing in the springtime, wait until the weather is really consistently 50 degrees during the day and at night as well. So
for about a week roughly.
Right.
Before you start to do.
Before you start.
Yeah, and everybody wants to get out. I mean, we want to get out there too.
Yeah, you want to get out. I know people have ordinances, or they they are just kind of itching to get it cleaned up.
And so I take it too that the gardens that you two and others are creating are also kind of catered toward pollinators. The sorts of flora you're bringing in, very much the sorts of flora that pollinators like.
Correct.
Right.
Too. And what we're bringing in too is we really emphasize native plants, because this is what they evolved with throughout the years. So, and we're creating a full habitat, or continuing with their life cycle. For example, monarchs, even though they migrate here, they will only lay their eggs on milkweed, and then the caterpillars hatch and they will only eat the milkweed leaves. They won't do it on any other plant. So if you don't have milkweed, the monarch will not lay its eggs.
Yeah, and there's other butterflies too that they rely on certain types of plants. So if you're somebody that's just not into gardening at all, they're just not your bag. If you plant one oak tree, you're supporting over 400 different types of caterpillar and moth species. Yeah. So trees, like people don't think about trees as being supportive of pollinators, but they actually are. You need to incorporate those native plants for the butterfly and moth caterpillars, as well as those native bees that may be specialists. It can be a bit complicated when you're just using native plants. It's not something you just can go up to any local store and get them. So,
So I actually used your website even before this podcast was even in my mind to help find native seed actually for something that my organization was doing. So yeah, I totally understand. It is hard to find native seed sometimes.
Glad we helped.
Yeah, you did.
That's one of our biggest things is we want to make it easy. Because we were beginners just like everybody else. We didn't know. So, and that's what people like about us too. At least I hope they like us. But
But like that sense of like, we were right there with you.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
That's great. Well, one last thing I just wanted to bring up, one other thing that I thought was really interesting that I heard. It seems like the monarch butterfly, the honeybee, those are very much symbolic sorts of insects for pollinators at large. But obviously they're not telling that whole story, especially when it comes to maybe some of these more native insects that aren't going to milkweed or are hibernating or or resting in some maybe less knowable places. So I just wanted to like bring that out too. That I don't know if that's like the correct framework that I have. But.
Yeah, we kind of have a running joke that we hook people with butterflies. Because that's typically when you talk about so we do talk about stats with pollinator decline. So like the monarch butterfly, for example, like you said, it's so recognizable, so majestic. Monarchs have declined about 90% since the early 90s. And so when we say that stat, and we've done a lot of talks at like garden clubs, like people that have been gardening for decades, they like gasp, like they have no idea. Right. And so, so I don't think people like they see things flying around their yard and they don't realize there is a problem and there is a decline. And so it helps, when we talk about this and we throw out some of those stats and it really like, it jars people and they I had no idea.
Definitely. Well, I'm very excited to talk a bit more. We've already teed up some other questions that I've had in mind and I'm really excited to get into them. First, though, we're going to hop into an intermission to give ourselves a break and our listeners a break as well.
Okay.
So for those tuning in, stay tuned. Common Groundwater is produced in partnership with NRDC, an international nonprofit environmental organization with more than 3 million members and online activists. Established in 1970, NRDC uses science, policy, law, and people power to confront the climate crisis, protect public health, and safeguard nature. You can learn more about its work, like its efforts around Michigan pollinators and pesticides, at nrdc.org. Welcome back, folks. You are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council. This is the start of our pollinator mini-series where we go around the state and talk about pollinators in the various ways that they interact with nature and agriculture and humans. I'm here today with the co-founders of Plymouth Pollinators, and we are talking about the ways in which pollinators interact in our neighborhoods and gardens and parks and things of that nature. We spent the start of the episode, David and Carly, talking about what pollinators were, what your organization is. I'd like to maybe spend the second half, maybe zooming out a little bit in some sorts of ways. The first is to give mention to the second half of your name, Plymouth Pollinators. We've talked about pollinators. I'd like to talk about like the Plymouth area a little bit. I've been to Plymouth a few times. I've been to some of the neighboring communities like Westland. I don't necessarily equate the two automatically to a vibrant pollinator community. And yet, here we are. There's a vibrant pollinator community happening here. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of having gardens, native plants, pollinators, what have you, in a sort of more suburban, neighborhood-based environment?
So there's a lot of large organizations out there right now that are, of course, the flagship of helping pollinators and working with legislation and big stuff, right? And so I think it's really important right now for smaller groups like ours, this kind of grassroots groups that have maybe a little bit more freedom, have more more connections like to or ties to the neighborhood or with the city municipalities, to kind of boots on the ground, right, doing this kind of thing. There's over 40 million acres of lawn in the U.S. alone. And so lawn doesn't do anything for anyone. That doesn't support any pollinators. It creates more work for us. And so, when you're in these spaces like this, like Plymouth, for us, no space is too small. So if everyone in the suburbs maybe took just a quarter of their lawn or their yard and designated it as a pollinator habitat, think about how many acres of habitat that we would be adding back into the ecosystem for pollinators. As citizens, we need to kind of take this into our own hands in order to help this issue. That's why I think it's really important. Probably one of the best compliments I ever got from pollinators is at one of the city commission meetings. I was giving a little update about the gardens and things like that. And one of the commissioners told me that she was walking around the neighborhood like she typically does, and she said, "You are changing the way people are gardening here in Plymouth." And that was really impactful to me, because I think we get so focused on our gardens and what we're doing and what the next event is or whatever, but it's making a difference in the neighborhood. And I think the fact that we're so accessible, people see us around town, they see our gardens, so it's just really important to have more groups like ours that are kind of leading the charge in the communities.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and then with Plymouth, actually I used to work for the water department, and every spring, summer, I'd get calls, "Why is my water bill so high?" And I'd look, like, "Hey, do you have a sprinkler system?" "Oh yeah." I'm like, "You're just watering your grass." I kind of did my own numbers, and it was like, an average house would use an extra 8,000 to 10,000 gallons of water just to water their grass for green. I would rather have the green in my back pocket and not spend the money on it. Plus, it's just wasteful. But it kind of opens people's eyes too by doing more of a native plant garden and helping the pollinators. You're not watering as much because these plants are drought resistant.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, people just don't know. And like I said earlier, we give some of these stats about percentages of pollinators that have declined, and you hear people gasping in the audience. They have no idea. They're just kind of in their little bubble and in their own little world. And so when you can have those conversations, and something that I feel we pride ourselves on is we don't shame people, so we don't come at this really hardcore. We try to meet people where they're at and understand that even though the goal is to have maybe 70% or 75% of your yard be native plants, someone's not just going to rip out your entire yard. So it's kind of like if you start small. And it is a bit of a gateway, because you do start small and then all of a sudden you get all this pollinator activity and it gets kind of exciting, and then you want to do a little more and then a little more and a little more. So, yeah.
The next thing you know, you start a nonprofit.
Right, and then you're talking to
you. That's the goal for the Plymouth area, to have multiple Plymouth pollinators.
Yes.
Yeah, and just FYI, so City of Plymouth is part of the Mayor's Monarch Pledge with the National Wildlife Federation.
Oh, very cool.
Yes.
There's even some policy-oriented changes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's free for them to do, and it's something, again, that the city gets, they can humble brag about that a little bit, and then it also brings legitimacy, to people, oh, maybe I should do this in my own yard. So, yeah.
To your point about education too, here I am, 5 years at the environmental council, learning things I've never learned. And I prep for this too, right? I prep for this before. So, I think that's a great approach, having a very compassionate mind toward all of this. Because ultimately, as you see each day, I'm sure you're out at the gardens, right? People are coming in and they like the gardens, they're interested in them. There's no malice behind any sort of, just not knowing.
Right, exactly.
Very cool. We talked a little bit about lawns as being not very helpful for pollinators, or even detrimental to them, into other sorts of biodiversity. Are there any other particular threats that you two are aware of when it comes to pollinators? Anything that they're facing either here, in the area or beyond?
Pesticides.
Yes,
That's a huge one. We talked about the monarch decline, that it's declined over 90%. And when you look at, I think it's Xerces that puts out a graph, and it shows year over year the trend. It was the early 90s, and that's when the neonics came out. So it's you can really see what's happened. So pesticide, obviously habitat loss is a huge one. Even in Plymouth, there's a lot of, homes that are being built and things like that. And people are opting for, I want more house and this much yard.
Yeah.
And so habitat loss is a big deal. Climate change, is another thing. So, but yeah, so I think those are some of the biggest threats. And also the fact that people aren't using native plants. They're not using plants that are, host plants for monarch or for butterfly or moths or for some of these like specialist bees. We get a lot of people that I'm creating a pollinator garden. We're putting in butterfly bush, and it's like, that's it's not a host plant.
It has it's in the name, yes, and probably the label had a picture of a butterfly on it, but it's
So
this is where Plymouth Pollinators comes in, and where the education matters is important, and the actual creation of physical structures and gardens are important.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other things you'd like to touch on when it comes to either threats or pollinators themselves before we go into our little final segment of our episode here? No pressure if not.
No, I can't think of anything. Just plant more native plants.
Yeah. And we're learning something new every day also. I mean, we're citizen scientists.
Yeah, we've made all the mistakes everyone else has made. I mean, I've had butterfly bushes. We've been there, we've done all that, and it's really, you have to kind of give yourself a break. It's an evolution, it's a completely different way of thinking. You have to give it some time, and you have to do it in stages, I think. So you're not gonna eat the whole elephant. So that's why, again, we talk about starting off small, like just a small part in your garden, and find an actual native plant nursery. So that's something, again, we try to take the guesswork out of that by putting it on our website. These are all these different places. There's so many native plant sales now, which is great. You can't just go up to, a big box store, and even though they may have, like Dave said, it might have a picture of a butterfly on it, or it'll say it's a pollinator, but it may be treated with neonics, or you don't know where it came from. So you have to kind of just take it a little bit at a time, but the education is out there.
Well, maybe that's the great transition then to my final question that I have for you too. Like, if people want to play a more active role, whether here in the area or beyond, what are some great ways for them to get started in doing that?
So, well, if they're in our area, they can always volunteer with us, or go to some of our events and things like that.
There's some books that we have posted that are good, just good reads to get you started and to understand better why we're doing certain things.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of organizations. I mean, just by looking,
Yeah.
I think even on your website you have like links to wild ones. Nationally organized groups.
Xerces, National Wildlife Federation. Yeah, those are all great. Documentaries are great. Plant sales are great. I've yet to meet a native plant vendor that doesn't want to talk about plants. So if you go to plant sales or go to a native plant nursery, they'll have great tips for you.
Need a lot of space either. We have our little micro gardens. We also have people doing container gardening. They live in condos and stuff like that. And like Carly said, every small space counts,
if you add it all together, it's so
we're creating like this like little native plant highway so they can travel. There's not these little wastelands or something.
Which is why. So we recently created an initiative called Pollination Station, and that's the whole meaning behind it. Is like these are little pit stops, for pollinators all around the community.
I think that works so well. I don't want to I'm not a scientist, but
neither are we.
Citizen scientists.
Citizen scientists. I remember learning in college about just like the power of contiguous land, right? Like land that's like all in coordination with one another, all kind of lined up. And although there's still segmentation between yard and yard, or yard and school garden or whatnot. In a way, you are kind of creating a contiguous sort of pollinator habitat throughout the city. And I think that's very neat and probably very helpful to the pollinators themselves. So well, that's wonderful. Before we go, anything else you want to shout out? Any events going on? Any other sorts of opportunities or resources?
We got Pollinator Week that's happening the whole following week. We've got some local businesses that are going to be participating. Like we'll be bringing them some swag and things like that. And
Ferndale.
We have the Ferndale Pollinator Parade can't remember what the date was, but it's in a couple of weeks. So, and then shortly after that, I'm hoping we just get some rest and we can we can just sit in the gardens and watch the pollinators.
Then we get to work on our gardens.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very true. This is peak pollinator season.
Yes.
Yeah, intentional for the podcast, but very busy for you two, which makes me all the more thankful that you two are able to join me today.
Oh, that's no problem.
Really appreciate it. Well, with that then, I think we can go on and wrap up. So, thank you both again. To folks in the audience, I will include links to Plymouth Pollinators website, which in turn has a lot of the events and resources that we've all talked about throughout the course of this podcast episode. And then I'll also have some links as well where you can learn about some larger scale pollination or pollinator efforts going on in the state and beyond. I want to give a shout out as well to our audience members themselves. Thank you for tuning in today. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for other episodes. Our next one will be on pollinators and their interaction with like ecosystems at large in a more like wilderness oriented environment. And then thank you as well to NRDC for making this podcast series possible. With that then, thanks
Thank
again.
you.
We'll see you around.
Thank you. Happy Pollinator Week.
Yes, happy Pollinator Week.